I came up with the keys to the White House solely by accident. In 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington, D.C. and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world. It's one of the reasons you're still here. And he said, in Washington, I fell in love with politics. And I always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. I have since used the system to predict every American presidential election from 1984 to 2020, including my successful prediction of the win for Donald Trump in 2016, which you can imagine did not make me very popular in Washington, D.C., where I teach, which is 90% plus Democrat. It's obviously too early to make a prediction for 2024, but I can give you some inside information about this, give you an insight that very few people have. You know, I've been very worried about the future of American politics.
Dr. Lichtman is serving as a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. since 1973. Dr. Lichtman is an acclaimed historian, author, and commentator who is co-credited with the creation of the Keys to the White House model in 1981, which is used as a tool to predict election results of US presidential elections. Dr. Lichtman has also authored a wide range of books, including The Case for Impeachment, Historians and the Living Past, the Theory and Practice of Historical Study, Ecological Inference, etc. He has received numerous awards during his career. Most notably, he was named Distinguished Professor of History in 2011 and Outstanding Scholar Teacher for 1992-93, the highest faculty award of the school. The GeoStrata welcomes you, Professor. It's indeed an honor and privilege to host you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So yeah, let's begin, sir. So before jumping to the domestic politics of United States, I had this question for you regarding your book, The 13 Keys to the White House. So, sir, there are these 13 precise points, which lead to the prediction of the presidential race and correctly. So how did you come up with it? And do you think that in future you will, have some additions in it, or you will change it, or something that you will do?
You know, I'd love to tell you that I came up with the keys to the White House by a lot of brilliant thinking, by ruining my eyes in the archives. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I came up with the keys to the White House solely by accident when I was distinguished visiting professor in 1981 at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, one of the one or two leading technological universities in the United States. And there I met a gentleman by the name of Volodya Kailis Borak from Moscow, the head of the Institute of Pattern Recognition and Earthquake Prediction in Moscow. And it was his idea that we should collaborate. And again, being brilliant and insightful, of course, I said, no, we're not. You know, earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. Caltech is right outside of Los Angeles, but I got to go back to American University in Washington, D.C. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. But he said, oh, no, I already solved earthquakes, right? He said, no. He said, get this. In 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington, D.C. and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world. It's one of the reasons you're still here, the nuclear test ban treaty that kept us from poisoning our atmosphere, our oceans, and our grasses. And he said, in Washington, I fell in love with politics. And I always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said, I live in the Soviet Union. Elections? forget it. It's extreme leader or off with your head. But you're an American historian. You know all about presidents and politics. So why don't we collaborate? So I agreed. And what we were going to do then was use the methodology of earthquake prediction known as pattern recognition to see what patterns in the political environment, not the physical environment like they do for earthquakes, were associated with victory and defeat for the party holding the White House. And to do this inquiry, we had to totally reconceptualize presidential elections. That is, we looked at them, this is 1981, not as Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan, the last two contestants, not as the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, not as liberals versus conservatives, but in geophysical earthquake terms, as stability, the party holding the White House keeps the White House, and earthquake, the party holding the White House is turned out of office. And with that reconceptualization, we looked at every American presidential election from 1860, the horse and buggy days of politics, when Abraham Lincoln was elected, to 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected. And we looked at factors in the political environment associated with stability versus earthquake. And that led us to the 13 keys to the White House, which are simply 13 true-false questions, which can be answered prior to a presidential election and diagnoses and predicts the outcome. And these are based on the theory that elections are primarily votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. And we also came up with a simple decision rule. If 6 or more of the keys turn against the White House party, that is, if 6 of the questions are answered false, then they're predicted losers. Fewer than 6 negative keys, the White House party is a predicted winner. This, of course, was retrospective analysis, but I have since used the system to predict every American presidential election from 1984 to 2020, including my successful prediction of the win for Donald Trump in 2016, which you can imagine did not make me very popular in Washington, D.C., where I teach, which is 90% plus Democratic. But I always tell people, look, these are predictions, not endorsements. If I simply predicted according to my own political views, I'd be wrong half the time.
That is very, very intriguing to me that you come up with this 13 points basically by a seismologist who started, getting this. So the journey is very surprising to me personally when it comes to these 13 points. So yeah, so moving on, based on these keys only, recently there were midterms in United States in 2022 only, November last month. And based on these keys only, and with no red wave in sight, what are we looking for in 2024?
Yeah, it's obviously too early to make a prediction for 2024. A lot can happen, and American politics is in a real situation of great flux. Sometimes the keys do fall into place early, but so far, not yet. But I can give you some inside information about this, give you an insight that very few people have. Here's what I can tell you. One of the lessons of the keys is to forget the pundits, forget the pollsters. They're like sports talk radio. They may be entertaining, but there's no basis for their opinions. They're not based on a model like the keys of how elections really work. And the conventional wisdom, the pundits are telling you the Democrats need to nominate someone else other than Joe Biden. They need fresh blood. Well, I'm not a physician, And I'm not going to comment on Biden's health or age. I'm not even that much younger than him myself. But the hard politics of 2024 so far, based on the keys, tell us the pundits are entirely wrong, that the Democrats' best chance for winning in 2024 turns on Biden running again. Let me explain. One of my keys is incumbency. If Biden doesn't run, the Democrats lose the incumbency key. It becomes an open seat election, which is very difficult for the White House party to win, as we saw, for example, in 2016 or 2008 or 2000. Secondly, there is an internal party fight key. If Biden doesn't run, there'll be a bitter battle within the Democratic Party because there's no heir apparent. So if Biden doesn't run, the Democrats lose 2 keys right at the top. And remember, it takes 6 keys to predict the Democrats will lose. That means if Biden doesn't run again, they only need to lose 4 more keys. But if Biden does run, they secure the incumbency key, they secure the party battle key, and they would need 6 more keys to predict a Democratic defeat. So it makes a huge difference in terms of the hard politics of 2024, whether Biden runs again. If he does run again, they're likely winners. If he doesn't run again, they can still win, but it's much less likely.
Okay, that is very interesting. And this is again something that you are predicting, and it is again something that, many in Washington are on the other side. As we see, there are many people who are saying that Biden should not run again because of his age. But again, it's something different here. So taking on from that, President Biden's party has passed many bills recently, and like IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, and there have been many other bills also in the main loop. So looking at all these things, the Washington has again started to be involved a lot in the economy. And with this, we have been seeing that, is there a change in the American electorate through this? Will these passing of these acts, big acts, have a impact on the behavior of the electorate or something?
I think we saw that in the midterm elections of 2022. Biden's approval rating was fairly low, but as you point out, he has an extraordinary record of domestic legislative accomplishments. He has achieved at least a half a dozen major bills. You outlined a couple of them, and there are many more. He has achieved a greater haul of domestic reform legislation since the 1960s. And that is really something. And we've seen in these midterm elections that the American people are not buying Donald Trump's lies about a stolen election. They don't want to replay 2020. They want concrete measures that improve their daily lives. And that is something that Biden has delivered with this incredible haul of domestic legislation. Plus, and this has been way underplayed in the press, Biden in many ways single-handedly saved Ukraine from being taken over by the Russians. And if that had happened, the consequences would be catastrophic for democracies all over the world. It was Biden who first perceived the Russian threat to Ukraine. It was Biden who brought together this Western coalition to provide Ukraine with the logistics and the weaponry it needed to resist the Russian invasion. It wasn't Macron in France. It wasn't Trudeau in Canada. It wasn't Merkel in Germany. It was Joe Biden who foresaw what was going to happen and organized the resistance. He hasn't gotten nearly the credit that he deserves from the American press for that.
Taking on from that only, sir, you mentioned that, Biden single-handedly did this Ukraine stuff, or, promoting this defense of Ukraine, promoting the defense of democracies within the Eastern Europe and also the Europe. So one of your keys, as I read your keys, is a major military achievement. So can we say that this is Biden's major military achievement, or are we looking forward to next 2 years and we have to wait? Or is this the one, the turning point?
Yeah, certainly the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is quite likely a foreign policy success. But as you said, the situation in Ukraine hasn't fully played out yet. And, it could turn negatively. I hope not, but that's certainly possible. So I am holding judgment on whether or not ultimately that's going to prove to be a turn the foreign policy success key in favor of the Democrats, but it certainly has the potential to do so. Moreover, the policy changes that you outlined, plus the changes he made by executive order, like rejoining the Paris Accords on climate change, reversing a lot of Donald Trump's attempts to undermine domestic environmental regulations. All of that has so far secured him the policy change key.
That is amazing again. So taking on from that, we are seeing that America is facing a lot of issues right now. There are many things going on in US. And with that, how do you think is the 2024 election going to be, very detrimental? How is it going to play on the institutions and the democratic structure of US? Are we going to see something very substantial happening, or is it a turning point election? Is it, when historians like you see back, okay, or the professors like you see back, are they going to see 2024 as a start of something new, in American politics, or is it not that big?
I've been very worried about the future of American politics. I even wrote a book about this. My most recent book is called 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump, in which I pointed out all the loopholes in the American political system that have enabled an anti-democratic candidate. And I mean small d, democratic system, not Democratic Party, that has enabled an anti-democratic party like Donald Trump to really threaten the future of American democracy. But I have to say, I've been a bit heartened by the 2022 elections. Election deniers, or as I prefer to call them, election liars, pretty much across the board in the swing states lost. Only a handful of those won compared to many, many more of these election liars who lost. And that was very encouraging. What is also encouraging, with the possible exception of losing gubernatorial candidate Kerry Lake in Arizona, the vast majority of these losing election deniers did not attempt to contest the results, did not claim that the election was stolen from them. And that includes Herschel Walker, who recently lost the runoff election for U.S. Senate in the state of Georgia. So I was heartened by that. I'm also heartened by the fact that there didn't seem to be any problems in the administration of this election. It seemed more like a normal election, perhaps, than maybe what we've been used to. And so maybe we are now moving more towards the normalization of American politics. That remains to be seen. There's still a lot of followers in the Republican Party who still believe the election was stolen, and there's still, the real possibility of further threats to American democracy. But the 2022 elections were very heartening, and perhaps do signal something of a return to more normal politics in the U.S.
Moving on to the domestic politics side from this only, there is a rising Hispanic voter turnout also in US. And we are also seeing that, the Hispanic voter is very important. So how has this, tried to change the future of US politics, or is it affecting the US politics in some ways where we may see that in some years this may change or something new may come up?
The makeup of the American electorate has fundamentally changed over the last few decades. It is no longer a predominantly white electorate, but there has been, a substantially rising minority vote. In fact, the largest growing voting group in the US is no longer Hispanics, it's Asian Americans. And so the minority voters in America are very diverse. They're African American, they're Hispanic, those are the two largest groups, but Asian Americans are creeping up and becoming a much more significant element of the voting public. After Mitt Romney lost in 2012 to Barack Obama, the Republican Party kind of had a reckoning in which they said, we really do need to respond to the growing minority element of the electorate. And they haven't. Minorities are still fairly solidly Democratic, although Hispanics have been a real battleground. And while they've still been majority Democratic, in some cases, Republicans have made inroads into the Hispanic vote because Hispanics, socially tend to be very religious and very, very conservative in their social approach, but, of course, liberal in their, approach to economics and government. So they have become something of a battleground and will continue to be a pivotal battleground between the two parties.
So can we say that the Hispanic voter is more of an independent voter when it comes to elections, or is it like there are parts of Hispanic voters which are Democratic and some parts are Republican?
They're a very important swing vote. They're still predominantly Democratic, but it does make a difference for elections, the extent to which Republicans were able to cut into the Hispanic vote. For example, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, who had a thumping big 19-point victory, did do extremely well with the Hispanic vote. Republicans in Texas have cut into the Hispanic vote. So I think Democrats need to take a lesson here that you can no longer take the Hispanic vote for granted, but you got to work hard to win the Hispanic vote and show that your policies are much more beneficial for Hispanics in this country than what the Republicans are offering.
As you mentioned, Governor Ron DeSantis, he had a sweeping win on the night in November. And many news channels were saying across America that the biggest winner of 2022 midterms is Ron DeSantis and the biggest loser is Trump. So do you think he's going to run in 2024, or do you think he will be, a silent spectator for 2024 and try to play it safe in 2028? And obviously, how does that also affect the US politics?
I have no inside information about Governor DeSantis's intentions, but just looking from the outside as an expert political analyst, I do believe that he is going to run for president. And right now, and again, it's early, the polls show that he would be very competitive with Donald Trump in Republican primaries. And again, I'm not much of a poll follower, but I think that's probably right. I do think he'd be a significant challenger, but I have a major caveat, and that is you never know how successful anyone is going to be in a presidential campaign until they actually become a candidate and a campaigner. There is nothing comparable to the white heat of a presidential campaign. And many individuals, candidates who were touted as excellent, overwhelmingly strong presidential candidates have wilted in the white heat of a presidential campaign. My favorite example is John Glenn, the great American hero, the astronaut, a senator from Ohio, considered, an enormously powerful presidential candidate, and totally wilted and melted under the white heat of a presidential campaign. So, Ron DeSantis has never run for anything larger than a single state. So it remains to be seen how successful he is going to be. Plus, he's not going to be the only non-Trump candidate running in that Republican primary process. You know, the king is wounded, and you know, the pretenders are going to come out and challenge the wounded king.
Exactly, sir. So, taking on from that only, there's a very famous saying in America, given by James Carville in 1992, that it's the economy, stupid. And the midterms, I think somewhere, like many people said, that the midterms show us that it's not always the economy. Is that true or not? Because even your key says that economy is a major part.
You know, that's one of the most misleading statements ever made by a shrewd political analyst. The keys show it's not just the economy. Economy is important. My 13 keys have 2 economic keys, but lots of other things factor into elections. Look at 2016. Economy was doing extremely well. Nothing wrong with the economy. No way you could attribute the defeat of the Democrats in 2016 to the economy. So you've got to look at the much broader picture. There are lots of other concerns that, you know, go into the electoral decision of Americans. Certainly, the economy is important. And just looking at the economy, you'd be right most of the time, but you'd also be wrong a lot of the time.
Exactly, sir. So apart from the economy turf, we have seen that there has been this Tea Party movement in US, which started, during the time of the Obama presidency. And this Tea Party movement, why I am stating this right now, because now we have a very fractured Republican majority within the House. And this very small Republican majority is going to lead to, many stoppages in the Washington when it comes to deciding something. Will that affect Biden's presidency in some part, or will the Tea Party faction inside the Republican Party will be a good for Democrats and will be a pro for Democrats, because there will be a fracture within inside the Republicans. So can we see that also adding to the keys of Biden?
Well, to the extent Republicans are divided and fighting among themselves, which I think is going to happen, that's obviously good for the opposition party. But on the other hand, the fact that there's this very strong right-wing caucus within the Republican Party and within the U.S. House means that the U.S. House is more likely to be an obstruction to continued domestic reform legislation on behalf of the Biden administration. So the Biden administration has got to be very careful in working with the House. And because Democrats only need to pick off 5 votes to get a majority, or 6 votes around there, they've got to work very carefully to pick off those who are repulsed by the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. And if they can get, a handful of votes for Democratic initiatives, then perhaps they can work even with a Republican House.
Exactly, sir. So can we see a bipartisan, kind of a fractured bipartisan era coming up, or is it too early to call?
I think, are you talking about bipartisan legislation?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's possible. We saw that even before the 2022 midterms. There was bipartisan agreement on gun control legislation, the first gun control legislation since the 1990s. There was bipartisan agreement on legislation to protect same-sex marriage. There was some bipartisan agreement on the legislation to promote chips manufacturing in the United States. So there are issues on which there can be bipartisan cooperation, but it's tough. You're going to need to win over some Republicans because, the votes in the House if you're a Democrat. And for most bills, you need to get 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a filibuster, Democrats only have 51 votes. So there's a lot of work that's the Biden administration and its allies in Congress are going to have to do if the administration is going to continue to score legislative successes.
As you mentioned, the gun control. So Second Amendment has affected the US politics a lot. So are we seeing a new churn in this, that maybe something changes with the Biden's next 2 years? That there is some act on Second Amendment, and how, if anything, happens regarding Second Amendment, because touching it sometimes is very volatile in US politics. Ruckus gets created. So how touching the Second Amendment may affect that 13 keys also, and in which particular zones?
Yeah. The greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people is the idea that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, as opposed to the keeping and bear arms to support a well-regulated militia. The notion that it was not an individual right, but a collective right for a militia prevailed in America for well over 200 years in federal court decisions. And that only changed with the Heller decision in 2012, in which I believe Antonin Scalia badly misinterpreted the historical record to claim an individual right to keep and bear arms is embedded in the Second Amendment. In fact, not a single one of the thousands of persons at the time involved in passing the Second Amendment in the Congress or ratifying the Second Amendment in the states ever said, not one, that this amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. And here's the most decisive argument. Who framed the Second Amendment? James Madison, a slaveholder. Slaveholders voted for the amendment in Congress and in the states. Do you think for one moment slaveholders would have voted for an amendment that gave Black people in the United States a unlimited right to keep and bear arms? Of course not. But by tying it to the militia, you kept arms out of the hands of Black people because Black people were barred from the militia. So this is the greatest hoax. And it is so unfortunate because the conservative Supreme Court has used this as a club to strike down gun control laws that actually protect Americans, like the permit law in New York State. Do you know that the handful of states with permit laws have gun death rates well under half of that of the remaining states? So, we need to face up to what the Second Amendment really is. We haven't done it, but there is some momentum to reconsider gun control legislation because of the horrific toll of gun violence. Do you know that an American today is 20 times more likely to be murdered by a gun than a resident of our most comparable peer nations, the G7 nations plus Australia? That's not 20% more likely, that's 20 times more likely. And again, the American people, according to the polls, are overwhelmingly in favor of expanded gun control legislation on things like background measures or assault weapons. But, within the Republican Party, they're still held hostage to the National Rifle Association and this misinterpretation of the Second Amendment, despite all the scandals that have plagued the National Rifle Association.
With this faction of Republican Party, which is, quite a lot dominated by the NRA, we have seen that there is, a sense of this new thing coming up, that there is an isolation between the people of rural America and they are left out by Washington somehow. Do you think that this also plays in US elections somehow and again affects the keys?
I'm not sure it affects the keys because the keys take all of this into account. But let me say, you're right. there is a very substantial segment of the American electorate, both Republicans and Democrats, who do feel that they are left out, that they have been abandoned by the so-called elites. And that was something very effectively exploited, at least for a while, by Donald Trump, certainly in 2016. But that argument, has begun to fade. As we saw, he has essentially presided over 3 losing election cycles for Republicans, 2018, 2020, and 2022. But there has been a big failure on the part of Democrats to reach out to these people. Democratic messaging has been really deficient. Certainly a lot of Democratic programs like the minimum wage, like bringing down drug prices, like expanding Medicaid, like building infrastructure, do in fact improve the lives of people who have felt that they've been left out. But the Democrats really haven't effectively sold that. For a while, the Democrats were great with messaging. Franklin Roosevelt was probably the greatest president in terms of political persuasion in U.S. history. But they've really been very deficient in recent years.
And that deficiency of connect between the elites, the so-called elites, that is the Washington, which is many times used as a word to describe the elites, and the rural America, is leading to many issues also. We are seeing that there has been a lot of uptick in many things that are radical, never seen in America, especially when I see it through an Indian eye, that, America is an example for democracy for every nation. So what do you think is this new uptick in voter right restrictions in US going to, due to the US domestic politics? How is it going to affect that?
Well, voter restrictions are very important, and they've been almost entirely adopted by red states, by Republican states, because for decades, Republicans have believed that low turnout benefits Republicans, and the higher turnout, which brings out particularly minority voters, benefits Democrats. And almost every Republican state has adopted some kind of voter restrictions, voter ID laws, restrictions on absentee ballots, restrictions on early voting, purging of voter registration rolls, disenfranchising former felons. These are extremely important and, have had an impact on American politics. But on the other hand, there's been a backlash against these restrictions that, leaders of the minority community have used the voter restrictions, like we saw in the state of Georgia, to spur minority turnout, to say, they're trying to stop you from voting and we're not going to let them do that. So, it's been a bit of a mixed bag in terms of its political impact. It certainly, makes it more difficult for people to vote, but it's also a motivating factor for people to vote.
So we have seen that lately there has been a huge turnout of people in elections. We saw that Donald Trump got almost more than 10 million votes than the previous, and Biden got the most votes when compared to any American president ever elected, the popular vote. So what is the factor that is changing this? Why are so many people coming out and voting?
Yes, I think, part of that is Donald Trump. Donald Trump spurs fierce loyalty and fierce opposition. We really haven't seen that for an American political leader in a very long time, maybe since Ronald Reagan in part, but even Ronald Reagan didn't quite stir this kind of fervent loyalty and fervent opposition. It's very hard to be neutral about Donald Trump. So I think that's been very important in spurring voter turnout to new records, both in presidential years and in midterm years. And I also think, that in the modern era, people are beginning to understand how important elections are. Elections have consequences. They matter. If Donald Trump had not won in 2016, we would not have a Supreme Court that overturned the right to safe and legal abortions. That has implications for virtually every American, not just women, but obviously, for men, for children, for families. That's just one example of the ways in which elections have enormous consequences. If Biden hadn't won in 2020, wouldn't have the infrastructure bill, wouldn't have the inflation control bill. We wouldn't have a new commitment to combating climate change. So I think that Americans increasingly are realizing just how important elections are. Politics is not irrelevant. The two parties are not the same. It makes a big difference now, whether you elect Republicans or Democrats. That might not have been so true, back in the time of Richard Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower, more moderate type of Republicans.
So what if it happens, what will a Biden versus Trump look like in 2024? Or if it happens, are we going to see some constitutional crisis, or is it going to be a normal election?
I think it will be a normal election, but if it is Donald Trump and he loses, I think he will try to create a constitutional crisis. But there's a big difference. He was president in 2020, and he could use all of the powers of his presidency to try to overturn the verdict of the voters. But if he loses in 2024, presuming it's Biden versus Trump, hypothetically, he won't have the power and prestige of the presidency behind him. And it will be vastly more difficult for him to make an effective effort to try to undermine American democracy.
So you have had an expansive career in understanding of the US politics. And this journey has been very long. As we see that you have almost predicted 9 elections correctly, and you have these 13 keys, which are, I think, the most important thing when I see it through the outside angle. When you go back in your career or you reflect your career, what do you think has been the turning point? And what do you think is the most important thing?
I'll tell you the secret for being an effective political analyst and particularly an effective predictor. And I'm really the only one in the world who has a structural predictive system based on history that goes all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. But here's the secret to being effective as an analyst and a predictor. You got no history, although that ain't it. Got no math, although that ain't it. Got no politics, well, that ain't it. The most important thing is to put aside your own personal preferences and preconceptions. If I were to make predictions based on my own political preferences, I'd be wrong half the time. I'd be useless as a predictor. That may sound like an easy thing, but it's really, really hard. That's why I think my training as an historian is important. Over many, many years in my training as an historian, I learned to be as impartial as possible, to examine the evidence and the logic of situations as thoroughly, as impartially as possible, and not let any biases creep into it. So, that is my ultimate lesson to you and all your viewers. Try to be as impartial as possible. Never abandon the search for truth through evidence and logic. Sadly, one of the worst effects of the Donald Trump presidency has been to undermine truth. They talk about alternative facts. They fabricate things like the stolen election in 2020. And I think the most important thing we can do moving forward is rededicate ourselves to finding the truth, no matter where it may lead. You know, it led me to predict Donald Trump in 2016, which I can assure you did not reflect my political preferences or the political preferences of the circles that I travel in. But my search for the truth led me there, and I unflinchingly had to recognize that.
That is very important, sir, to put our biases behind and then see it through a very clear mirror. So, what will your suggestion be to a student anywhere in the world, like I am here in India, or someone in United Kingdom, someone in any European country or an African country, how to see US politics now, how to, understand it when someone is a beginner or someone has an interest in it?
I think for anyone around the world, particularly for you young people, it's really important to understand that even in the United States, the world's longest continuous running democracy, democracy is not something that can be taken for granted, but must be defended, advocated for, protected. You know, democracy is precious, but like all precious things, it can be destroyed. You know, in the aftermath of World War I, we had the first golden age of democracy, and we had about 24 democracies out of almost none. Then by the early 1940s, the number of democracies had been more than cut in half, down to only about 10 to 11. Democracy flourished again in the late 20th century, but in recent years, we've seen the decline of democracies. We've seen many few pure democracies in the world. So my lesson to everyone is, if you want to preserve democracy, which is the only way a government can serve ordinary people, you've got to defend it. You've got to fight for it. You've got to take nothing for granted.
So it was really great talking to you, sir. It was like you answered all our questions and extensively, and with a very deep research you have. You took up the historic points of how, comparing Ronald Reagan and to the Ronald Reagan to the current Biden administration, everything was taken up. And even James Madison was brought up, and everything from Second Amendment, Roe v. Wade, we had everything, we discussed everything, and it is very astonishing to talk to you, and the amount of sizable knowledge that you bring to the desk is enormous. And we got to know a lot about US politics today. It has been an honor hosting you, and as I personally said that I'm your personal fan, so it is a very big deal. And all 105 of us at the GeoStrata really thank you for coming today to us, and it was great hosting you, and we got to know a lot. Thank you
very much. Thank you for the excellent questions.